In this episode of The Sustainability Experts, Dr. Raj Shah, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, joins us. Prior to his work at Rockefeller, he was in the White House as the 16th administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and saved millions of lives by successfully containing the fight against Ebola, executing a response to the earthquake in Haiti, and improving conditions to end the famine in Somalia. In October of 2023, he released his groundbreaking book, Big Bets: How Large-Scale Change Really Happens. Raj, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
It's great to be with you, and I admire everything you're doing. So I'm glad to be here.
Well, I love this book. I think there's some really interesting principles for both, individuals in the public and private sector to take away from really creating large-scale change. I want to talk about your 5 principles that you list in this book. 1, being positive. 2, being bold. 3, finding innovative solutions. And 4, I thought this one was interesting, recruiting unlikely partners. And lastly, fiercely measuring results, which I think is really poignant because you talk about being evidence-based really being the solution to a lot of these crises in terms of deploying people. So I'd really like to talk about how you develop these principles, and also talk about this recruiting unlikely partners, because I think that's a really interesting question.
Sure. Well, look, I think I wrote this book because I really believe it's possible to make large-scale change happen. And I'm just a regular person born in a normal family outside of Detroit, and found myself working with Bill Gates, as you pointed out, when he started their foundation, Bill and Melinda, and then with President Obama and the Obama administration, and now running Rockefeller. And I feel like through these experiences, I've seen so many examples, whether it's examples I've been a part of or just observed from and supported from afar, of people being bold, of saying, we're not going to accept the status quo as it is. We're not going to pursue incremental change. We're not going to allow doing good to be good enough. We're going to hold ourselves to the same disciplines you might hold yourself to in Silicon Valley to change the world at scale. And those principles you laid out are exactly those, the principles that I think should define these big, bold bets to end hunger, to stop pandemics, to end energy poverty, and to make the world more equitable and more fair. Every single one of the examples in the book relies on unlikely partnerships. Like that is to your point, that is the central theme. And I think people who are good at making big bets and leading them have to naturally become good at getting to know lots of different types of people and learning how to bring them together in the spirit of change and transformation and teaming. That's probably a pretty normal thing for most entrepreneurs, but it's true in the public sector and in the social sector. And, I talk about a whole host of examples. Just one is from my time in politics when, after the 2008 financial crisis, there was a huge food crisis, actually, and 100 million people had been pushed back into hunger, extreme poverty. There were articles on the front page of The Economist about a young girl in Haiti eating a mud cake where they took grain and mixed it with mud because that gives a greater feeling of satiety in a context of being extremely hungry. And that's just wrong. And not only is that wrong, that was leading to more than 40 episodes of political strife and violence and conflict and migration around the world, which is so tightly correlated to food insecurity, because when you're hungry, you are desperate. And so the president said, let's do something about this at scale, but let's not tinker around the margins. Let's get everyone involved. And ultimately, we were able to, over 4 or 5 years, move 100 million people out of hunger and extreme poverty. We were able to do it using a public-private partnership approach. But the only reason we succeeded was we built a unique coalition across progressive Democrats in Congress who, cared about these issues, and super conservative, faith-based Republicans who also cared deeply about these issues. And I learned the hard way the need to really build collaborations and partnerships, but I would sit in those offices with those senators. We would pray together. We would travel together. We would talk about tough issues together, and we'd allow ourselves to be vulnerable with each other in the spirit of building a deeper values-based set of friendships and relationships. And ultimately, folks like Jim Inhofe and John Bozeman and Time now Speaker McCarthy are the people who led the passage of the Global Food Security Act and reestablished America's lead role in pulling people off the brink of hunger and disaster. So it can be done, but I write in the book about what it takes to kind of get it done, which in that case was being very personal, very vulnerable, and very authentic about building different kinds of relationships with people who are perceived as politically on the opposite side of the spectrum.
I think that's a really powerful point about finding the common thread in terms of our values, even with these, unlikely partners. Um, one thing that always brings us together is being evidence-based, and you talk about this a lot in the book. Can you talk about the integration of going back to the data, even when it made you pivot your strategy?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because, I guess in the private sector, it's sort of obvious that if you don't have data, you can't track profit and loss, you can't hit your metrics and your milestones, it's very hard to succeed. In the public sector and in social service work, it does take more discipline to make sure everyone understands that actually this is about measuring results and solving problems at scale, not just
Hmm.
being proud of the effort you're making that is in fact well intentioned. And one very important example of that was in 2014. There was an Ebola crisis in West Africa. Ebola is a hemorrhagic fever. It was causing a pandemic in that region. People were literally dying in the streets, bleeding to death visibly. And the spread was extraordinary. And 70% of people who got Ebola in that setting died. It was the
Wow.
highest mortality rate you've ever seen in any Ebola outbreak. And so, we had a choice. The CDC was estimating that 1.6 million cases would explode out of Africa and land around the world, including the United States. And we had to decide, with President Obama in the lead, that we would take the fight to Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea. And so we
Hmm.
deployed American troops. We put together a large humanitarian and medical response. I led the West African response. And what was amazing about the response was when we landed on the ground, we did not actually know which strategies would work to reduce the mortality rate and the contagious of COVID of Ebola in that setting. And so we needed data, but we didn't have it. We with the data was hearsay. It would take 4 or 5 days to validate.
Hmm.
So we deployed bioterror labs into rural communities so you could get faster data validation. We used helicopters from the World Food Program to transport blood samples so that you
Hmm.
get faster data validation. We had young adults on motorbikes, sort of semi-validating data because in that setting, even imperfect data that is semi-validated is better than sitting around waiting for days
Hmm.
for a proper lab result. And once we started getting more real-time data, we could say, okay, the things we were trying to do, in that case, move people that were infected into Ebola treatment units, was simply not going to work. And the things that we hadn't yet invented were going to be the solution to ending the crisis. That in
Hmm.
particular, people who died, their family members, often young women, would wash the bodies and pay
Wow.
respects and hug and dress the bodies for burial. And those practices were the main point of contagiousness and spread. So we invented these burial teams with WHO certified body bags that would go in full garb and protective equipment and remove the bodies of the deceased in a dignified, culturally acceptable manner. And then we saw in the data that actually this kind of new little intervention was far more important than Ebola treatment units and all these medical hospitals that were being set up in terms of actually reducing spread. And at the end of the day, instead of 1.6 million cases, we had 30,000. And instead of thousands of deaths in the United States, we had basically no mortality in the United States as a result of a successful effort in West Africa.
Wow. Well, I know this speaks to your leadership in terms of not only deploying teams on the ground and being really evidence based, but also in terms of your leadership style, because you also went on the ground yourself for a lot of these crises. And in the case of the Ebola crisis, you put on the Ebola suit yourself and went on the ground. And what you discovered from that was that this suit was really hard to take on and off. It was easy to infect yourself. And that was why most of the people who were working there were actually infecting themselves as health professionals. So you really put yourself in health workers' shoes. And I want to talk about that as a really important leadership strategy of really empathizing with everyone throughout your organization, because I think it's really poignant. Can you speak to the importance of leaders putting themselves in the shoes of their colleagues?
Yeah, well, so it turned out in the summer of 2014, Liberia lost about three-quarters of its healthcare workers from Ebola. And it was because these courageous women, primarily women, nurses and community health workers, were putting on protective equipment and then going to offer supportive care to those who were on their deathbeds dying of Ebola. But they were doing what they could to help. And it just turned out that if you actually try to take that equipment off after doing that in super hot tropical environment in July, in West Africa, you're dripping with sweat. You pick up the mask and you'd end up touching your eyes and your sclera and other mucosal membranes around your mouth. And before you know it, you also have Ebola, and you would therefore be subjected to a 70% mortality rate. So we did pull together innovators from DuPont and NASA and MIT and USAID, and we said, let's all get in a room and figure out how just design a suit so you don't have to touch your goggles and your face mask in order to remove. It's called doffing, in order to doff the protective equipment. And they in fact designed one that had a kind of zipper up top and opened in the back and just peeled off of you much more safely. So, innovations can make a big difference. You just have to accept that you got to keep experimenting to find the right solutions.
When you're taking on these big risks and big bets, some of these challenges can be incredibly intimidating when we're talking about systemic issues like this. Can you talk about when leaders are overwhelmed by the scale of the problem and may even face imposter syndrome? How do they get through it? And can you talk about a little bit more about your experience? I know you talk a little bit about it in the book, but how can leaders take on these big bets when they're dealing with really intimidatingly large crises?
I think it's one big reason leadership should be less lonely. That we should just recognize that no one has the answers here. I write in the book a few different examples of, maybe you'd call it imposter syndrome, but like the first time I walked into the Oval Office and I was assigned by President Obama to lead this massive, world's largest humanitarian response in Haiti. And I walk into the Oval Office, and probably only my second or third time doing a business meeting in the Oval Office. And President Obama and Vice President Biden at the time are like facing the window looking outside, so they didn't see me walk in. Biden is telling Obama, are you sure about putting this Raj Shah guy in charge? He's like 30 something and he's been in his job for 6 days or a week. And then they see me, Obama sees me, and he like stops the conversation and walks over, and they were incredible. And I thank a lot of my career to both President Obama and Joe Biden. But imposter syndrome is a real thing, and you feel it a lot. So having a safe space to be vulnerable and to ask for advice is just really special.
Well, we're very grateful to you for that. So I wanted to ask also about the Rockefeller Impact Investing Platform, because this is a really interesting initiative that Rockefeller is taking on, in which you're actually helping clients pick investments for impact investing. So this is a really interesting role for a nonprofit to be taking part in, asset management and consulting. So I wanted to talk about kind of your vision for this and how there's been a proven track record of finding substantially better returns for your organization. So can we talk a little bit about how can corporations get involved with this, and what is your vision here?
We have a very significant, we call it an innovative finance portfolio, where we try to help creative financial thinkers develop instruments like the Forest Resilience Bond, and dozens of other instruments that can actually tie investment to outcomes in a way that some segment of the investor base is willing to assign and allocate resources to. And I'll tell you, I first learned about this space more than 20 years ago when, and I write about this in the book Big Bets, where we were actually trying to ask the question, how do you vaccinate every child on the planet? And about 50 million kids a year were not getting vaccines. And therefore the number of children under the age of 5 dying every year was quite high, like 11 million kids a year. And it turns out, in order to solve that problem, we needed both to raise a lot of additional financing, but to raise a certain type of financing that was front loaded and tied and tethered to real outcomes on saving lives and vaccinating kids. And so, together with Gordon Brown, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the governments of France and Norway and others, we designed, I think, what was the world's first big social impact bond, an immunization bond that went out at around $6 billion, uh, re reshaped the global vaccine industry, helped us create a supply base in India and elsewhere for large scale, low cost manufacture. And 20 years later, 980 million kids vaccinated, 16 million child lives saved is one of the metrics we measure as an outcome. And so I really believe innovative financial instruments can work. In that case, the bonds were backed by governments and tethered to payments from governments to this vaccine alliance based on performance. And that model, has so much potential to help us unlock and create a culture of impact investing. I don't expect every dollar invested to be tied to impact and impact metrics, but there's some share of investable capital where people want to know that in addition to getting appropriate returns or along those lines, they can also deliver those outcomes and results.
Well, I think that these finance instruments are becoming increasingly popular across the board. How do you think corporations can take advantage of these opportunities in impact investing more so? Because more and more businesses are becoming interested in doing well and doing good. How can they take advantage of this?
Well, absolutely. Look, I think there are a whole suite of opportunities now. It's not 20 years ago. Today you can be involved in acquiring carbon credits that are not your grandfather's carbon credits. They're
Right.
validated and they're serious and they're making a big difference. You can be involved in a lot of blended finance instruments. We just actually closed a transaction in the Eastern Congo, an area ravaged by war and conflict, where I have sat, and I write in the book about sitting with these kids and hearing their stories of what it's like to have war just rip through your community.
Wow.
This is a community that's never had real access to electricity. And as a result, you can't create jobs, you can't grow businesses, you can't create that upward cycle of economic opportunity. And we just closed a $70 million set of projects to bring solar electrification to these
Wow.
communities in a commercial model, where about $7 or so million of our resource goes in to take the first loss in a blended finance instrument. And then the rest
Mhm.
of it is different forms of impact and commercial investment blended together. And I think those types of instruments are going to be a huge part of how the world pivots 60, 70, 80 countries off of coal and
Yeah.
diesel and heavy fuel oil and onto renewable energy technologies. And that's just starting to grow as an investable set of opportunities. So, I mean, I could go on for days. I think regenerative agriculture is another space where, as Mark Tursek and others have worked on, we know much more about how to measure changes in soil health and how to price the value of improving and sequestering carbon in the production system for food. And it just goes on and on. So
Yeah.
I think everyone who's I think if you have resources and you're an investor, seriously considering some modest allocation of your portfolio in impact instruments that are validated, that are quantitative, and that deliver results is an important and useful way to expand your horizons.
Absolutely. And kind of within that scope, I know you use the word data-driven compassion in your TED Talk. And within the scope of impact investing, do you have kind of advice or frameworks and methodologies surrounding impact analytics within regards to framing what kind of investment you would define as an actual impact investment versus maybe ESG or philanthropy and things like that? And then also the kind of how you define success for an impact investment, because there's even within impact investing, there's a lot of different methodologies in terms of how you can define success.
Yeah, there are a lot of different methodologies, but they all sort of come back to the same basic reality, which I think is consistent with what I write about in the book, which is be clear about the problem you're trying to solve. What is the actual result you seek? And be rigorous about measuring in quantitative way impact
Mhm.
against that outcome, and report it in real time and iterate on those learnings. And that has worked in fighting pandemics at home and abroad. It's worked in addressing hunger at scale and through crises and through slower moving challenges, and its work to transform global health and fight diseases across the planet. And I think that every financial impact instrument I've seen depends on an effective and rigorous measurement system. And so the lessons I take away are simple is better than complex, because it just is, and that's how the world works. And it takes more time, effort, and energy to simplify the reporting and simplify the metrics you're studying. Obviously, real-time data is more important than data that is highly validated but arrives years too late. And so the trend towards real-time data is really quite critical. And then finally is transparency, is that, you would want to be in a field and a space with impact investing where there's actual significant transparency around, obviously, both the financial results, but also the impact results. And I think we see that. I mean, we've seen instruments that are tethered to recidivism rates and prison structures in the UK, and sequestration of carbon in American agriculture, and the improvement of fisheries off the coast of Bangladesh. And in all cases, those basic principles define whether you have a successful measurement structure or not.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I also wanted to kind of shift gears to another topic that you talk about a lot, which is economic prosperity as well. And you've often used the statistic that in the past, 90% of American children could do better than their parents, and today it's less than 50%. And kind of in light of that increasing economic inequality, I'd like to talk about some of the ways in which corporations and corporate leaders can use some channels to help improve that economic prosperity. We often talk about wages being a huge part of that, but are there some of other avenues and other channels that you think that corporations could play a really big role, especially in the United States, of increasing economic prosperity?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that. I write in my book about my grandfather, who was an accountant in India, and he emptied his retirement account to buy a one-way plane ticket for my dad in the late 1960s to come to this country with an
Wow.
educational scholarship to get a master's in engineering from the University of Arizona. And my dad went on to work on the Apollo programs and at Ford Motor Company for a very long time. And it all worked out great. But it's so interesting to me that my grandfather, who had never been to America, had so much faith in the American
Mm.
dream. And
Yeah.
interestingly, when you look back at that era, he was totally right. 90% of kids did better than their parents. And that was true across our society. And then that started to change around the mid 80s. And basically, if you're born in this century, as you point out, the chance that you're going to do better than your parents in America is now less than 50%. And we just can't let the American dream escape so many American families. And so what are the things we can do to change that? Well, one critical one is education and making sure everybody has a platform to be successful. We
Hmm.
we see way too many American families, as many 60-70%, have no financial cushion whatsoever, $400 or $500 to deal with an emergency. So are
Hmm.
highly vulnerable. That's why small income transfers that are tied to work and children have been amongst the most effective social policy programs in America to create expansion and expanded opportunity, the American dream. The earned income tax credit, basically a negative income tax introduced by Richard Nixon, expanded
Mm.
by Bill Clinton, is probably the most effective social
Wow.
policy instrument we have to lift up working families and give their kids better hope. We just
Mhm.
went through the biggest policy experiment we've had in decades with the child tax credit, which cut child poverty in America by more than 50%. And almost all the dollars spent by those families was spent investing in kids having more opportunity for the future. So
Yeah.
businesses can become advocates for those proven evidence-based social policies that will create a more productive workforce and a more equitable society for business in the future. And then finally, we do a lot in American policy through tax and through companies. And so whether
Right.
it's the benefits that are offered because they're tax preferenced, or the wages that companies choose to pay. It's like creating
Hmm.
those, and the use of stock options, which I think Silicon Valley obviously does phenomenally well, but could be much
Yeah.
more broadly accessible to more workers in the country. are the types of tools that help build equity over a longer period of time and are not yet widespread throughout our economy.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, for kind of some of the corporate leaders who, see this overwhelming problem and really want to get involved and want their businesses to be a part of it, what advice would you give to them in terms of how they can get involved with increasing more economic prosperity as well?
Well, I really believe the first thing is use your voice.
Mm.
This is a country that now we listen to business, we listen to business leaders. Use your voice to make the case that these efficient policies should be bipartisan or nonpartisan and are fundamentally about giving workers and working families a chance to be more confident about their children's future. And I
Mm.
think that's step one. I think step two is, as much as possible, walk the talk, right? And so if you're employing a large number of contract employees or others and not offering basic benefits or not offering even clarity and consistency in work shift hours for your employees,
Yeah.
that you're part of the problem, and you can solve that. And others have solved that more efficiently. We work with companies and we work with local communities across this country. And I will say, when you highlight these things and then introduce companies to best practice across the country, people want to do better. It's just they don't, necessarily know
Know
how to
how.
get there and know that getting there can be done in a way that enhances and doesn't threaten the bottom line.
Yeah.
So it starts with a real desire to be part of the solution and then a willingness to put time, effort, and your voice against the task.
Absolutely. I think that's great advice. And kind of on a similar note is within the scope of ESG, E often takes over in a lot of regards, and we fail to talk about a lot of the social factors in which businesses can get involved. Sometimes we talk about forced labor or diversity in the workplace, but it normally kind of ends there in terms of the scope. And I was wondering, this is a rapidly evolving industry and it needs a lot of leadership, and it also needs kind of a vision of where it can go to and how more robust it can be. So I was wondering, kind of within the S and ESG, do you have a vision in terms of how you think business leaders should be leading or improving in terms of S?
Well, I think across all three terms that are in this now term of art, we have to do better at reporting out data and information that is less kind of marketing and social responsibility oriented
Hmm.
and more tethered to like real business statistics. So, for
Yeah.
example, if we do a lot of work with big food companies to say, can you transition 20, 30, 50% of your supply chains to climate smart and regenerative agricultural practices?
Hmm.
Those are things that can be measured with genuine discipline, and you
Hmm.
can publish those measures and show progress over time, as opposed to just sort of highlighting the case studies
Sure.
that sound good. Similarly, on the social element, knowing the impacts of supply chains, of contracting relationships, and of how your employees are doing, and not just what they're earning. That's
Hmm.
all data that can be collected and shared. And, it obviously has to be sort of stepwise, but a big theme of the book, Big Bets, is about data, rigor, and measurement. And I do think the ESG movement is slowly becoming more rigorous and more transparent around that data. But we all know there's been appropriate criticism for the early days, which were a little bit
Yeah.
more glossy reports than serious, analytics applied to the task.
Absolutely.
So I
Absolutely.
would say only use the words if you want to do the work to put serious data and analytics against how your company is performing, because otherwise you're sort of undermining the spirit of what this movement is about.
Absolutely. And well, just to wrap it up, kind of with the last question, I'm wondering if you have any last advice for business leaders who want to incorporate more impact in their businesses, and also what they should be taking away from the principles in your book as well.
Well, thank you for asking. I do think a lot of the moments when I was a part of efforts that were really transformative for the human condition, fighting successfully a horrific famine in Somalia in 2011, and changing the face of hunger in that context, because Cargill, led by Greg Page, donated an entire ship's worth of rice, 6 million metric tons, on a moment's notice, or working with vaccine manufacturers to transform the supply base for vaccinations so that there were enough cheap vaccines available for lower income countries to vaccinate 40 or 50 million kids a year that weren't otherwise getting product. I could go on and on. All of those required building relationships with
Mm.
across the public and private sector. And I write in the book about a lesson learned called make it personal. Just a lot of times it's easy to characterize what companies are like if you're on the public sector side, and it's certainly easy to characterize government and government performance if you're in the private sector. But I would challenge each of your CEO listeners and their colleagues to go find 2 or 3 relationships that you nurture that are in the public sector or the NGO sector that touch on your work, so that you can start to build trust with people that over time you can then work with in a much more profound way. And if I hadn't learned through sometimes tough experiences how to do that, I don't think I would have known how to just pick up the phone and call the CEO of Cargill to try to avert thousands of additional lives lost in the context of stopping a famine in its tracks. And so make it personal, build those relationships, and then be part of the solution.
Well, thank you so much, Raj, for coming on the podcast and sharing with us these insights. Your book is a huge inspiration. So thank you so much for taking the time.
And thank you, Vanessa.